What I want to do is set things up for us to have a collaborative discussion, exploring together, see if we can come together up with some kind of multifaceted conception of what the post-critical is, or what it is to be post-critical. And so I'd like to postpone, you'll get that later, and we may not even get to it, depending on how the discussion goes. But I want to lay a little groundwork first for that. Many of you know that I've been wrestling with what it is to be post-critical for quite some time. My first serious effort was my dissertation, Mastered Irony, the Point of Entry into a Post-Critical Epistemology. Mastered irony is a phrase taken from Kierkegaard's own dissertation, the last chapter of his dissertation. The dissertation was entitled The Concept of Irony with Constant Reference to Socrates. But I'm not going to go into what I had to say there, at least not in any direct way. Mainly, I just want to say that I've been wrestling with this for quite some time, and I keep thinking, well, I thought I took care of that a while back, but I keep having to come back and wrestle with it. It's because it seems to have a lot of different facets, levels of meaning. At least it's hard to pin down. Then, next, I'm reminded in a variety of ways, partly from Poteet, but probably mostly from fellow Poteet students, that you can't come up with a simple easy mastery of things like what this is about. There was a group of us that met for several years, sometimes called by a variety of names, including the Cosa Nostra and Cosa Nostra della Poteet, and the Dutch Creek Falls Symposium, and a variety of other names. But we never settled on a permanent one. But I remember at least 2 or 3 of the sessions, maybe all of them to some extent, were characterized by the frustration that some of us felt. And I remember Taylor Scott saying, what we're about? Well, fooling around. Because we couldn't really ever seem to pin it down to anyone's satisfaction, or there was a reluctance to do so. And then there was...
Excuse me, what did you say at the end of what Taylor said?
It's fooling around. That's what Poteet students were about. Fooling around, yeah.
Not in any sexual sense.
Anyway, but what I kept getting this reluctance to, which I have a kind of natural disposition in this direction from a variety of sources, I think, but a natural disposition to try to come up with some kind of capsule summary, and there's a lot of reluctance to move in that direction. And I think rightfully so. Part of the reason, I think, is that the powerful temptation, not just in certain persons like myself, but in modernity generally, is to come up with a summary in a way that makes us masters and possessors of it. And whatever the post-critical is about has to do with giving up that presumption that things can be simply mastered and possessed in that kind of way. And then part of the reason why it's difficult to really be satisfied with articulating what it is to be post-critical stems from the fact that we aren't really post-critical in terms of the culture, and that's been brought up in lots of ways since the beginning of the conference. And when we're trying to communicate with other colleagues and students and just ordinary people what we are about, or what Poteet was about, or what Polanyi was about, it's not just that there are certain difficult concepts to articulate, but in important respects, if they thought post-critically, they would have the same words but different meanings. And I'll address this again in just a moment. But there's a sense in which it's like being introduced from one world into another, one whole culture into another. And that's problematic in a lot of ways, but nevertheless, it's, I do run into that. Just a concept like what it is to reflect and what it is to be critical, or what critical thinking is. It just, you try to talk and make sense about a Polanyian post-critical perspective about what that means, and they don't understand, because their immediate associations and connections are so strong to move in the taken for granted modernist critical perspective. Poteet's own words are, at least I find, good to return back to from time to time. It's the last sentence to Persons and Places, when he writes, "This self-liberation will require a disciplined, arduous, relentless, painful, and patient process of seeking a post-Cartesian intellectual equilibrium, working at every point against the grain of our entire culture, denying ourselves the respite and the sweet pleasures of rushing into the street every fortnight with some new messianic word." So, at least at these points, the point of when Poteet articulates this, and whatever he means by it, the natural impatience I have to sort of get to the end is sort of say, it's not to be had, at least not to be had in my lifetime. It's a multifaceted topic, what it is to be post-critical, and I think in important respects it cannot simply be characterized in a few words. And one of the things that points to this is that different people have tried to write some things on it, particularly in the pages of tradition and discovery, and they don't all say the same things. They pick up on different facets. And it's difficult to sort of boil them down, or when you do, you're going to be missing something else, or I come across something else that doesn't fit. So what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to sketch out sort of a groundwork for our jointly together coming to a characterization of what it is to be post-critical. And then I'm going to lead you in this discussion, and Dick is going to help me with writing ideas that get expressed down on the board, and maybe more than one board here, depends on how many things come out. And then we're going to try to work with these together and see if we can come up with something jointly out of this that goes beyond even what I myself could come up or have come up with. At the conclusion of that, I'm going to pass out my paper where I list a variety of things that are specific contributions that Polanyi makes, as I think he does, and Poteet makes, and maybe some things that come from outside of them, or just we don't know. We aren't too sure where under what label to place them. So first, my initial characterizations. Post-critical is an adjective, a characterizing feature of what? A variety of things. Polanyi first used it, as far as I've been able to tell, to refer to a distinctive philosophical program or philosophy, and also to a new age of Western civilization. He does this in The Logic of Liberty. It's a very brief thing. He does it in one place. He uses the word, and he doesn't elaborate. Okay? I have it in the footnote to my paper when he writes this. It would seem to me that on the day when the it would seem to me that on the day when the modern skeptic first placed his trust in the Catholic Church to rescue his liberties against the Frankenstein monster of his own creation, a vast cycle of human thought had come full swing. He's referring to some public statement made it was reported in newspapers, I think, in Eastern Europe, that said it's better to place our trust in the Catholic Church than in the authorities in our culture. This was in 1942, I think, or thereabouts. Anyway, it was in full awareness of the disasters that have been wrought by the Second World War and the various ideologies of Nazism and Marxism and so forth were there. And so there seemed to be, at that point, among a variety of people, expressed in this one skeptic apparently, who was willing to say, it's better we, for all its faults, put our trust in the Catholic Church than to put our trust in full secularization of our culture, which he had been in terms of the Enlightenment model. In any case, he says, the sphere of doubt has been circumnavigated. The critical enterprise which gave rise to the Renaissance and the Reformation and started the rise of our science, philosophy, and art had matured to its conclusion and had reached its final limits. We have thus begun to live in a new intellectual period which I would call the post-critical age of Western civilization. Secondly, I say it's been used also in reference to an orientation, a perspective of thought or of thinking, to a cultural movement, to an intellectual sensibility, to a set of ideas. We could go on from there, no doubt. Second, following Phil Mullen's suggestion in an article he's written on the post-critical that was published in Polaniana, it's the Hungarian Polanian journal on Polanian philosophy. Phil Mullins suggests that there is a sense in which post-critical is a symbol, not just a concept. A symbol with many meanings, multiple meanings, and important meanings at one and the same time. There's a richness and depth to the concept. Third, to be post-critical is to stand in contrast with being critical, and deliberately to do so. To be post-critical is to presume to displace or supplant a critical cast of thought, specifically to displace that cast of thought that has characterized the core of the modern European Enlightenment and what claims allegiance to the Enlightenment. More, it is to be aware of this critical cast of thought as something radically problematic, and perhaps also with some sense of why and how it is problematic. To say this is to give scope to what it is to be post-critical, a huge scope, and a historical reference. To be post-critical thus refers to a presumptive change or transformation in intellectual culture from critical intellectual culture to post-critical intellectual culture. I have found it helpful to think of the change from critical to post-critical, fourth, as a major shift of perspective, a shift in sensibility, a shift in cultural ethos, the sort of thing that Thomas Kuhn gave to the name, to which Thomas Kuhn gave the name paradigm shift. Now, neither Polanyi nor Poteet, I think, used that phrase, paradigm shift, in exactly the way that Kuhn used it. Partly because of its connotation of Kuhn's flirtation with a non-realist epistemology, but I think it nevertheless fits, at least in some respects. Polanyi wrote of shifts between frameworks of thought, in personal knowledge, shifts between frameworks of thought where no linear logical inferences could provide a bridge. Shifts that required leaps of irreversible intuitive integration to accomplish. The term irreversible is a term that Poteet uses a lot in Recovering the Ground when he distinguishes reversible logical moves and irreversible logical moves. Polanyi didn't directly speak of the shift between a critical and a post-critical framework as being of this specific nature of shift involving irreversible logical moves, but I believe that all he did say about such shifts clearly applies to this case. And until I'm convinced to the contrary, and I'm open to serious argument to the contrary, I believe the phrase paradigm shift may be applied, being careful not to bring in tow Kuhn's epistemological problems. And if we think about paradigm shift especially if we have an acquaintance in any more greater depth with what Kuhn meant by it and how he explained it in terms of, let's say, paradigms were typically, and you're talking about the revolutions in scientific understanding, and the paradigm shifts had to do in any way with taking certain, especially certain experiments, historical experiments that were made, as paradigms of the whole scientific ethos, or the whole new scientific understanding. So it wasn't just a new idea or a new theory, it was from shifting from one paradigm to another, but very much something relatively concrete. That is, it was this kind of a scientific experiment or a research program coming out of this that constitutes the new paradigm. If we think of the shift between a critical to a post-critical frame of reference as a shift in paradigms of that nature, it kind of, to me, gives a little focus to the query. Okay, what is it that constitutes the one paradigm and what's the other? A helpful thing that Kuhn does have to say about paradigm shifts within a field of natural science is that the conceptual vocabulary of the field is radically modified when a paradigm shift takes place. The conceptual vocabulary of persons thinking in accordance with a new paradigm comes to have quite different connections and associations than the same words have for persons thinking in accordance with the old paradigm. And the same is true vice versa. At times, these differences can be so radical that persons operating in accordance with the old paradigm are, for all intents and purposes, incapable of understanding things conceived in accordance with the new paradigm, particularly if they, the old paradigm persons, aren't disposed to considering that attempts to think in accordance with the new paradigm might merit some serious empathy. Although the inverse challenge can also be great, new paradigm persons thinking in terms of what the old paradigm persons are saying, that can be a challenge, but it's usually much easier for such persons to empathize than the opposite way. My point is that the peculiar conundrum of empathetic understanding across a paradigm shift seems to me to apply particularly well to the shift from a critical to a post-critical perspective. In particular, we should not be at all surprised that a post-critical understanding of words and concepts like subjective, objective, personal reality, truth, value, personal reality, truth, value, knowledge, experience, perception, body, mind-body, and so forth, even critical thinking, does not and never will make straightforward sense to colleagues well entrenched within the critical paradigm. Thinking of any of these as under the new paradigm doesn't really make a lot of sense to people who understand those same terms, but with different meanings under the old paradigm. Fifth, the change from a critical to a post-critical is not just a cultural shift, and in this respect, calling it a paradigm shift might be slightly misleading, as if it were merely an intellectual change. Poteet, particularly, more than Polanyi, took pains to point out that the shift from a critical to a post-critical paradigm involves an existential transformation, a coming to and owning up to oneself as one truly is, as a responsible person, a person responsible for whatever is being claimed or presented, giving it backing. This, of course, implies that living under, or better, identifying with, the critical paradigm is in fundamental respect to miss and fall short of owning up to oneself as a responsible person. Sixth, another important feature of what it means to be post-critical is that it is something more and bigger, perhaps even other than Polanyi's own philosophical vocabulary and perspective, than Poteet's philosophical vocabulary and perspective. My point is, it wasn't just their idea. It is something that they sought to call our attention to and encourage us to appropriate and participate in. Although from a perspective of what might be called Polanyi scholarship or Poteet scholarship, they certainly did operate with some such idea, Polanyi's idea, Poteet's idea. And we could compose articles specifically on Polanyi's idea of, say, a post-critical philosophy or Poteet's idea of a post-critical logic. Okay? Were we to do this, I believe we would miss something extraordinarily important to both Polanyi and to Poteet, even if it's true that Polanyi invented the word. I'm not quite sure that he did, but I don't know anybody that's found another usage of it by anyone prior. Why? Because the approach of good objective scholarship in this sense is not innocent of the issues between the critical and the post-critical paradigms. Now, my project is not an attempt to pin down precisely what Polanyi or Poteet has said and written on the subject, but to articulate in a way that renders it attractive, comprehensible, and more readily communicated, at least than I have been prior to this project, to get at what Polanyi and Poteet were getting at. As Poteet would say, to go for the jugular. But then that's maybe in tension with this idea of coming up with a capsule summary that would make us masters and possessors. Both Polanyi and Poteet sought to have us recognize and acknowledge and participate in this shift for ourselves, to get at what they themselves were striving to get at, and not just to be able accurately to report their ideas. In fact, for the most part, at least in the years that I was working directly with Poteet, we didn't talk about Poteet's philosophy at all. And many of us, and I can cite names, for a long time, they hadn't any idea what Poteet was about. And Poteet, if you asked him, he wouldn't own it. That's important. Okay. A metaphor might help here. Both Polanyi and Poteet had cited a movement, a wave of change within 20th century intellectual culture, and not, maybe it's a smaller wave than we thought, not just a development in their thought, to which a wave that they sought to call our attention, a wave they not only saw, but they caught and urged us as well to catch in the way that a surfer catches a wave. In effect, they urged us to catch this wave and surf it, to draw on it, to flow with it, to discover its presence in new and hitherto undetected places, even places that they had not detected, and to contribute to that change. And both Polanyi and Poteet saw it in other thinkers, even though those thinkers maybe were not entirely or wholly post-critical. These were thinkers that are moving in that direction, in effect. And also things outside of particular thinkers. So that's my prefatory stage for our discussion. What I would like to have you each, maybe already printed up one, but here are copies of let me get this sum going in the back here. There's lots more. There may be more needed back here. So I'd like to enlist your participation in a collaborative effort to identify features of what it is to be post-critical.
How much will this count for our grade?
80%. If you like, you can write things out on this now. You don't have to write things out because we're going to, as things are verbally articulated, we'll try to get them down on the board. But I want to say, if you write something out and you want to keep this, I'd like you to hand it in first and I'll get it back to you. Now, here's another list. And so it has all the problems associated with what Ben had to say. So I nevertheless want to share a few things, because this happens to be what I think are some of my strengths and to work in, and I try to work with that. I mean, I dance the dance I can dance, whatever. I'm not going to read the key, what I list, starting on page, they're not there's not a number at each page, but on page 5, going in from the front and back, there's a list of what I take to be key contributions in understanding what it is to be post-critical from Polanyi. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list. It's meant to some extent, temporarily to exhaust my understanding, that's all. Then on page 7 starts a list of key contributions by Poteet, and this is what I'd like to go through with some allusions to what we've talked about here and identified on the board. First, to be post-critical is to become, this is the bottom of page 7. To be post-critical is to become aware that there is a tacit pre-reflective dimension to the modern critical perspective. In other words, its existential context, especially evident when it is recognized to be something that is lived and embodied by persons, above all, as something lived and embodied by ourselves. Specifically, to be post-critical is to become aware of the ironic contradictions that pervade the modern critical perspective as lived, and ultimately, in Poteet's terms, ultimately to become aware of its insanity. This heightened consciousness of the irony of the modern mind and how to combat it and still survive is something learned by apprenticeship, in my understanding, at least in experience, from a master of irony and of Socratic dialectics like Bill Poteet, more than something one can learn by direct instruction alone. But that's how sort of assumption I've been operating on for years and still, in many respects, do, but meet somebody like Kiran Kashel, who he caught it without having that direct instruction. Second, in words different from the previously described feature, but along the same lines, to be post-critical is to become alert, to be aware of, and engaged in counteracting certain abstract pictures that we both have and imagine ourselves in the midst of. That's Poteet's phrase, or Wittgenstein's phrase, pictures that hold us captive. In Polanyian Meditations, Poteet also spoke of the powerful influence upon us of metaphorical intentionalities at work in the language of our culture that we would like to take for granted and entrust ourselves to, but that can entangle our imagination when we might least suspect them. In these captivating pictures, and implicate us in abetting skeptical, relativist, scientismist, reductionist, and even nihilist views without realizing it. However, not all metaphorical intentionalities, nor all pictures that we both have and imagine ourselves in the midst of are problematic or misleading in this respect. Poteet was particularly concerned to alert us to misleading abstractions and pictures associated with Cartesianism and how to counteract them. That's just repeating what's been mentioned several times in the conference. To be post-critical, third, is to realize what it is that generates these problematic abstractions in the first place. Not just historically, but more so what in the present renders these abstractions plausible and convincing. Namely, the intellectual posture of non-committal, detached, impersonal reflection, what Poteet dubbed the theater of solitude. Itself generated by an attitude of doubt and suspicion toward any candidate for belief that does not first prove itself worthy of belief. This I call the control center, as it were, of the modern critical movement, the central stronghold of the European Enlightenment, this posture of reflection. To be post-critical is to recognize this intellectual posture, despite the many benefits which have and continue to come from its employment. To recognize this posture is inherently problematic and not at all the neutral, innocent, and useful intellectual strategy it is commonly supposed to be. Though supposed to be a means of transcending or avoiding the biases and gullibility of human subjectivity, it conceals within itself a distorted and highly problematic expression of egoistic subjectivity known as objectivism. To suppose that this picture of ourselves in the posture of reflection is how it actually is with us in the world and in relation to the objects about which we're reflecting is to be radically confused, and to act upon that supposition is insanity. To be post-critical is to recover another, more fundamental ground for reflection, the ground of all concreteness. Poteet, that's Poteet's phrase, the ground of all concreteness, the most concrete of realities. To be post-critical is to recover a more fundamental ground for reflection, the whence from which all abstraction, whether beneficial or problematic, emerges, namely our pre-reflective mind bodies in the common sense world, convivially alongside one another. Here is where our understanding of things, especially our most fundamental concepts and concerns, hang together and make what sense they have. Nothing makes any sense at all apart from its rootedness within this concrete context. It's important to keep in mind that the mind body, or the pre-reflective mind body, is not a reflectively objectified something or other out there. A superficial reading of Poteet immediately gives that impression, because it's something articulated, it's out there, and you can think of it as somehow out there, thinking of it as somehow other than ourselves. But that's, if you follow Poteet's reasoning, it's you've got to trace it by turning inward to some extent, and phenomenologically, this isn't a word that Poteet uses, but Merleau-Ponty uses it, and I think it's brilliant insight into this. You have to slacken the intentional threads to bring them to light.
Slacken what?
The intentional threads. You can't break them. You can't step outside of them. Consequently, fifth, to be post-critical is to be suspicious and uneasy with anything that is a product of the critical intellectual posture just sketched. When considering such things, to be post-critical is always, first, to exit the theater of solitude and this posture of reflection, and recover one's convivial mind-bodily ground in order to assess these products of critical reflection for what they are, to regard and assess them in their true light. I think, for me, that is really key to understanding Poteet's understanding of moving to the post-critical, at least as articulated in his last books. Again, to be post-critical is to be suspicious and uneasy with anything that is a product of the critical intellectual posture just sketched. This is where Poteet also articulates, or seeks to articulate, what it is to post-critically to do criticism from within this groundedness in the body.
Are we turning doubt upon itself?
In some respects, yes, but not on its own. To return doubt upon itself only results in the postmodernist deconstructionist confusions. You've got to be regrounded. You've got to step outside, to exit the theater of solitude. And contact with persons. Dance, art can help us do that. Some important themes of this return from abstraction to the ground of concreteness, again, the most concrete of all realities, according to Poteet, are as follows. Recovery of our oral experience, relationality, and timefulness from captivity to the pervasive, deep-seated metaphors drawn from literacy and vision, without losing the gains of literacy and the visual. So it's not throwing them out completely, still affirming them. In that sense, Poteet still affirms, or say there's room to affirm the benefits of the Enlightenment while criticizing. Second, recovery of our sense of, it involves also recovery of our sense of place, of locality, of familiarity and orientation from being caught up in the disorienting abstractions of infinite homogeneous space, without losing the occasional usefulness of geometrized abstractions of spatiality. Third, recovery of the protensions, the retrotensions, the moments of significance, the rhythms of embodied temporality from the abstractions of homogeneous clock time, without losing occasional usefulness of thinking metaphorically of time spread out timelessly as a spatial dimension. Fourth, recovery of Hebraic metaphors of being, presence, particularity, historicity, limitless possibility, revelation, and encounter from being caught up in the Enlightenment's repudiation of these specific metaphors in biased favor of Hellenistic metaphors of timelessness, universal forms, necessity, and so forth, without losing the usefulness of those metaphors. Recovery of patterns of irreversible, non-formalizable logical inference from captivity to the idea of a complete and closed formal system of logic, without losing the usefulness on occasion of reversible, formalized patterns of inference. Recovery of the multiplicity of forms and uses of language and gesture, with multiple levels and types and ambiguities of communicative meaning, especially at the boundaries of creative articulation, pregnant silence, and what we feel but are not yet able to articulate, from captivity to a univocal, wholly explicit, exact ideal of articulation, without losing the usefulness of clear and distinct statement when a situation calls for it. Recovery of the well springs of our passion, reasons of our heart, and sense of personal calling that are to be found within the apparent limitations and humbleness of our own parochial background and personal experience, from the idea that it is only by divorcing ourselves from these limited, humble roots that we can participate in truly authentic intellectual life, without losing the benefits of an expanded cultural horizon gained from a modern education. Last in the series, recovery of our own unique access to being, the access we have in our own unique person, as a person among persons, and through our own personal presence, relationship, and indwelling participation as a point of access to the discovery of truth in common with other persons, including persons very unlike ourselves, from the idea that there is no access, recovery of all that from the idea that there is no access to objective truth except by leaving behind one's own unique person and adopting an impersonal, universal pattern of thinking, without losing the benefit of using in certain appropriate contexts formally universal patterns of thinking. Moving on in the larger series, to be post-critical for Bill Poteet, I believe, is to recover for what for many is a forgotten strand in the long-standing controversy over the relationship between reason and faith, a strand pretty much lost after the rise to prominence of the scholastic Aristotelian presumption of the priority of intellect to will in the 13th century medieval Europe, and therewith the priority of what Pascal was to call reasons of the intellect to reasons of the heart. Actually, Pascal was following Augustine in what came to be known as monastic theology, as distinct from scholastic theology in the medieval period. Pascal was, in that sense, in criticizing the doctrine, he taught that a person can only, Augustine taught that a person can only come truly to know and understand something if that person loves it. It's our love that orients us to the truth of something, and without love, our reason gets distracted, disoriented, and distorted by our desire for manipulation and control. So for Bill Poteet, to be post-critical, we must learn to counteract the modern critical impulse to know and understand a thing so as to be its master and possessor. We need rather to recover and cultivate our intellectual passions, our love for truth, good, beauty, and justice, in order post-critically to know and understand a thing for its own sake, which is a contemplative kind of knowing and appreciation.
Bill, I have to say that we are about 5 minutes over.
Okay, I was thinking we had till 11:30, but 12:30, but I just thank you. I'll just give a thumbnail sketch of where I'm heading here. In the next long section, what I basically try to say why it was important that Poteet reached out to these other thinkers that we were talking about in our last session, and what he was doing, and my take on that. And I next identify what I think are some specific paradigms that characterize the post-critical in opposition to parallel paradigms in the critical. And then come back to this whole thing of that we live nevertheless in two worlds. We, at least would like to be. We'd like to depart for the post-critical, but we are not there and not likely to become there soon. How do we live in the present is the question I'm raising. I don't answer it here. And right at the end, before the postscript, which I'm not going to mention at all, is that just in final summary, the central core or idea of the shift from the critical to the post-critical is on page 14. It's 3 pages from the end. Yeah. It's a shift from critical suspicion as the prime mover of inquiry and the strategies of abstraction that go with it, to participative methodological faith as the prime mover of inquiry and the strategies of empathetic indwelling, concretion, and contextualization that go with it.